Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is danielgormally. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to talk about why my chess career has gone downhill. Now there's two reasons why it's gone downhill. Firstly, why has my rating dropped? So my peak was 2573, which was in 2006. However, like a lot of older players, so I'm currently 48 going on 49, a lot of older players have seen our ratings drop because of deflation. So once it came back from the pandemic in 2020 or whatever it was, 2021, when people started playing a lot of new players came on the rating list who hadn't been there before. That caused some kind of rate deflation. So their ratings hadn't caught up with the reality of how strong they were because they've been playing a lot during lockdown, practicing a lot online and so on, and therefore when we played them in tournaments they were dragging our ratings down. So anyone who's established, who was playing a lot, fairly active. My opponent in this next game, Richard Pert, I think he's already featured on this channel actually, so he's getting a lot of games on this channel. He has also seen his rating drop. I think his peak was about 2460, 2470. He's actually got 2 GM norms already, I believe, and he's going for a third one. So that's one reason, is rating deflation. The other reason, which I want to explain in this game, is I tend to get nervous. So at some point I will start playing impulsively, my ego will take over, and I will stop calculating at critical moments. And that is crucial. The fact that I'm not actually calculating, I'm reacting. And that is something I noticed in my games. So it's something that actually dates back to the British Championship 2022. So I was doing a commentary with a good friend of mine, Adam Hunt, who sadly passed away recently. And at some point Daniel Fernandez came in to show off a game that he played against Mark Hebden. He explained how he actually went for a certain position in the opening because he felt that Mark wasn't so good when the central pawns had been exchanged or something like that. So he clearly was thinking very deeply about what his opponent's weaknesses were, and I thought that was quite interesting because I never really do that. I don't even know what my own weaknesses were. So I asked him, like half jokingly, I said, what are my weaknesses? And he said, maybe when it's like +1 or you're like -1, you don't defend as well as other people. And I thought that was very interesting, and it was something I hadn't really thought about myself. So I started thinking about it. I thought actually that made sense, because I kept collapsing in games and I didn't really understand why. I thought, why am I not defending well? Why am I collapsing when I'm under a little bit of pressure? And I think the reason is because at some point I will stop calculating. The chimp brain will take over. So the computer brain is in control in the early part of the game, but and I'm calculating the variations. But at some point I will get nervous, anxiety will kick in, I will feel under pressure, and I will start reacting rather than actually processing the calculations, processing the variations. So this next game is actually a classic example of that. So I was playing Richard, who plays for Cheddleton Savills Catering, playing against Blackthorn. So Cheddleton, I did play for Cheddleton years ago, one of the teams I played for as well. But Savills Catering, that's a new sponsor that they've got. I think Richard got that himself, so well done to him. So he went here, and I rejected Knight F6 because of Bishop F4, but probably I should have gone for something more dynamic like the King's Indian. I think these kind of classical positions that we got in the game are not really my cup of tea. Hang on, let's just go back to the game. So we end up in a position with an isolated pawn, and the first critical moment, so Richard went Bishop D2, which I was slightly surprised of. I was surprised by, I should say. I was expecting him to play Knight C3 and after castles to play the move B3. Just develop the bishop that way, and I thought white is slightly better. Bishop will come to B2. I didn't really love my position, to be honest. It's a typical isolated pawn position where you could end up being worse for quite a long time, but on the other hand, some pieces have been exchanged, so I've got plenty of room to maneuver. Generally, actually, exchanges favour the side that is fighting against the isolated pawn because it reduces my attacking prospects. So this position is slightly better for white, I think. But instead of that, Richard played bishop d2. And at this point in the game, my computer brain is in control. I'm calculating reasonably well. I'm in control of my emotions. But, you know, hang around, you might see a different development. So knight bd2 was played by Richard. That was a good move. So yeah, so this is the first critical moment. So one variation I did calculate was to take and then go d4. However, I was uncertain what was happening after the move rook fd1, because if white takes on d4, then clearly queen d4 is very drawish. A lot of pieces are going to come off the board. There's really no advantage for either side. It's probably going to be a draw fairly quickly. He'll probably take on d4. I'll take back and he'll put a rook on d1 or something. I don't think there's going to be much going on here. It's probably going to be a draw. However, he could play rook fd1, so I wasn't completely certain, because then my pawn is attacked. If I take on e3, he's going to take back the queen. He's got a little bit of pressure. Now there were variations like queen a5 I was trying to calculate, rook d7, queen b5. Again, I wasn't certain. I thought he might play something like, no, queen b3 is blunder, yeah. So again, maybe I saw queen b3 and I thought queen b3 is a good move here for white. It was very bad calculation, because obviously queen takes e5 wins the piece for nothing. So yeah, so maybe this position I was uncertain about. He can put a rook on d1 maybe and claim that even if he loses b2, he's got a bit of pressure on the 7th rank. So maybe I wasn't completely certain. You could also go for a move like queen b6. So I think this is what top level chess is about, or well, not top level, because me and Richard aren't top level, but we're close to it. Where it's often fine lines between getting an easy draw or being a little bit under pressure. So that's where your calculation becomes so important. That's become such a critical part of the game, because calculating the lines correctly and exhaustively is really a fundamental thing about being a strong chess player. But I didn't really do that in this game well enough. I did it to a reasonable degree, but not quite well enough. So I rejected that variation for that reason. There is also, sorry, I should also mention after this, after queen a5, there's also queen b6. You can trade and go for this endgame, but I do have a bit of pressure down the a file, so that's probably also holdable. Queen a5, he does have this move which you have to calculate, and again I might just reject this out of laziness almost, because I'm thinking, well, king f7, rook d7 looks very scary, that looks unpleasant, let's reject that. Boom. You know, it's like no lighty, no likey, you know, that film, sorry, not film, program, Take Me Out or something like that, right? I'm not taking queen a5 out because I'm not liking knight takes f7, which looks scary, because king f7, rook d7, and then you have to go king f6. But again, it might be laziness, because apparently white has no win after king f6, I think, according to the engine. If you go queen f3, maybe just king g6 is still a draw. So again, might be laziness, partly is what's holding me back. However, I decided to go instead for a variation where it's not completely liquidated with d4, but I get a reasonable bishop on f6. So I went knight g5. He obviously felt that this, I think we both calculated, the bishop takes f6, knight f3, gf3, queen f6, queen d5 wasn't necessarily better for white because of the pawn on f3. White king is weak. I could even maybe play a consolidating move like b6, getting ready to play rook d8. Don't really think he's got enough here, so I think that would have been okay for black. So he decides to trade on g5, and then he drops knight back, bishop f6, queen b6, rook a d8. Again, I think my initial idea was to go rook fd8, but then I kind of changed my mind. I decided to put the rooks on, because I thought if I go rook d8 and then rook c8 later, maybe he's just going to chop on c8 and take on d5. So I went rook a d8. queen d3, and again rook e4 maybe not the best. I think it was okay though. I could have gone king g7. I probably should have just played like an improving move like king g7. White can maybe consider moves like g4. You know, weirdly, actually after the game I was wondering whether I should have gone instead of rook e8. Yeah, actually rook e8 is okay, but after h3 I wondered if I should have just gone h5, because that really prevents g4 or discourages g4, because something like this does not work out well for white. But in the game I don't think Richard ever went g4 anyway, so it became a little bit irrelevant. But rook e4, so he's got a bit of mild pressure here because the queen is coming in here. So again, you know, a little bit dangerous signs for a player who doesn't seem to handle pressure very well at the moment. You know, that he's got any pressure at all. Now I could trade immediately and put the rook on b6, but then he would be better. He would be clearly better because I'd have an isolated pawn. Or he would certainly be better there, I think. I mean, again, maybe this is defendable with a move like this, but it looks a little bit unpleasant, right? You know, the pawn is blockaded. I'm never threatening to go d4 because he's just going to take it. So a little bit early, so I went rook c6, which I'm fairly happy with. Richard went queen f4, it looks very natural. I went king g7. Again, I was afraid of moves like g4 here. Wasn't sure about it, but apparently you can in some variations put a bishop on b2. I was a little bit scared of that. He went knight d4, which actually was not the best. I think g4 actually was better, but still knight d4 is okay. I traded. Yeah, so this is maybe the first really critical moment. Here I made like a bad practical decision, and you know, had a lot of time here. I had over half an hour at this point in the game. So bear in mind when you say half an hour, because this is what I don't like about this increment, because you never really know how much time you have. You have to work out, you know, how many moves we got left. We've got like 13 moves to time control. So until move 40, if I've got half an hour, and I'm going to get an extra 30 seconds a move. In fact, I think I had over half an hour at this point. I had about half an hour left at the end of the game, right? But I've got effectively 13 would be about 7.5 minutes. So it's about 37.5 minutes. That's a lot of time in a fairly simple position to work out what's going on. So one variation I very strongly considered was to take. Now, if he takes here immediately, I guess this is very dry and drawish, right? Because maybe I could even prevent the rook coming here. You could argue that white has a tiny edge here due to the fact that he's got possession of the c-file, but it's so minimal. I mean, I can always put the rook on e7 as well. It's so minimal that it's irrelevant. So the reason I rejected this was I thought he could take with the e pawn, and I saw queen d6. I thought, well, if he moves the queen away, then clearly I'm doing okay. I did actually consider queen e5, actually. That was interesting, but I think, you know, I'm not sure white would be particularly happy about black getting a passed pawn, so maybe you could go king f1, but then there's variations like rook d5, f4, g5, which you'd have to calculate, which don't look completely clear. After g3 I could maybe take and then go here. I think this is fine for black. It's equal. However, the reason I rejected it was I thought he could take and go rook c7, and I felt this is slightly uncomfortable. But again, this is where being calm under pressure, and also because you're calm under pressure, you're taking those variations a little bit further. You're not cutting them off too quickly. So in this position, I could play rook a6, hitting the pawn. That's one. It's not the only move. I mean, I think there are other ways to equalise. But if I go rook here, it's a little bit awkward because he goes rook d7, and then if I go here, yeah, I mean, this is probably still a draw, actually, to be honest. But it's a little bit unpleasant because the rook is active on d7. But quickly, I'm going king f6, king e6. So, but the rook could still go back to c7, but then I go rook b4. So say some variation like king f1, king here, king here, king here, rook here. It's a little bit awkward because if I go here, he can go here. So even these simple kind of rook and pawn endgames can be a little bit tricky. Even though the engine would probably say this is still a draw, right? I guess. But it looks a little bit unpleasant from a human perspective. However, we go back to initial position. I can simply go rook a6, hitting the pawn. Rook c2 is too passive to be a winning attempt. So a4, it's not difficult to calculate this variation. This will take you a few seconds. You know, this is where the laziness comes in, and I think the laziness is also linked to nerves, bad nerves. a4, rook b6, hitting the pawn on c3, and this really kills white's winning chances because, again, rook c3 too passive. Black is maybe even the one pressing after rook b4 because you have to go rook d3. Well, you don't, I mean, you could also go rook c7 there. Well, rook c7, rook b3. So rook c5, but then rook b3. So it's just a draw basically. So that would have been a draw if I just taken on d4. But instead, I decided, you know, rather foolishly to keep the game going, I went rook e8. And Richard went knight f3, and again, this is where yeah, maybe I should have thought about maybe moves like queen a6 here was maybe a better try. I'm not sure, but I'm afraid of his rook coming into the 7th rank. This is already starting to look a little bit awkward for black. So I went rook e4, and now I was as soon as I went rook e4, I started getting very, what happens if he goes queen b8? Actually, I wandered away from the board, and I started thinking in my head, what happens if he goes queen b8? I think I went to the toilet at this point. And, you know, I was thinking about it in my head, obviously, you know, just, well, I didn't think about it on Stockfish or on my phone, well, I probably wouldn't have lost the game if I had, but I was thinking about it in my head. I was worried about queen b8. And I thought, well, you know, I did see queen b8 when I was rook e4, but I started underestimating it. I think I underestimated it. I thought I'm okay here. But in fact, this looks a little bit dangerous for black because if you go here, can he not go afford a checkmate? And then if you take it as some variation like rook g8, king here, queen f8 check, king here, g4, winning the rook. So then you'd have to argue that this is somehow okay for black, but it doesn't look okay, does it? You know, I think there's knight h2 check actually. That's probably one way for white to win the game. So yeah, stuff like this. Okay, don't get me wrong, that's a very bad defense by black. I think there are better ways to defend this position. But the fact that I'm even allowing queen b8 when I could have just almost cashed in a draw earlier with bishop d4. Again, that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, when you're trying to play at a high level, like IM versus GM is a reasonably high level, and Richard probably would have been GM by now if he hadn't had a full-time job. You know, it's often fine lines, so you have to nail down a draw, which I didn't do in this game. So queen b8, I was very afraid of. Actually, if we check, maybe we could check the engine later. What is the best defense after queen b8? Richard went queen c7, which initially I was quite relieved by, but then I started to collapse in this position. So, for example, one variation I calculated was this, and then rook b4. But apparently rook b4 is not the best move, and that actually gives white the advantage. I can't remember why, but apparently this is not the best move. So I should go rook e7, but that looks a little bit unpleasant. Like, let's say, for example, if he trades, the bishop looks maybe inferior to the knight, you know, because I can't, it's very difficult for me to ever liquidate with d4, so I could bring the king to d3. But again, the engine's is not worried about this, just says it's a draw. But from a human perspective, it looks a little bit scary, it looks a little bit uncomfortable. So I think that's, again, you know, why you need these technical skills, why you need to know these endgames, why you need to have these really good technical skills, so you can be confident about making these decisions. And I think I just wasn't confident about whether I would hold these endgames. So I was like always keeping the queens on when I had the chance to. So I went queen e6, which is a strange move. And I think my idea was if he takes on here, I was going to go rook e3. That was what I was considering. But I think Richard mentioned this variation after the game that he could go rook c6 here, maybe. And maybe this is also good because rook e1 check, he goes king h2. But looks a little bit scary because there's moves like bishop e5 check. Yeah, bishop e5. I think this is what I calculated. And then queen f5. And it's not so clear. I'm hitting the knight. I mean, I would have rejected this, because if knight e1, there's queen f2 check. As soon as I see that as white, I'll be a little bit afraid, but maybe you can just go king g2, actually, thinking about it now. Not sure what the move is after king g2. Maybe rook e2 is playable, with an idea of threat of bishop d4. Bishop d4 is now a massive threat. He could even lose this as white. But queen e7 is, you know, it's actually quite an interesting variation. Queen e7, for example, is possible. Bear in mind that white, no, white is white a pawn up here? No, white isn't a pawn up here. Yeah, so actually probably not that great for white. Queen e4 maybe, or some. Yeah, there might even be queen e4 with a threat of rook f2 followed by bishop g3, forcing him to liquidate into a drawn endgame of queen takes e5. So I don't know. This is probably poor analysis by me, but variations like this are possible. But I think he made the right practical decision. Didn't take the pawn. He simply went rook d1. That was a good decision. Keeping the pressure on. So I went d4. So I felt like I had to play this. I had to keep active. If he took with a knight, actually my plan was to take here. And if he takes with a pawn, actually what was my plan here? Maybe it was to go rook e2 anyway. Because rook e1, actually this looks... Yeah, I was calculating a variation like this. Queen f2. I don't like this. d5. This d pawn is starting to romp. Admittedly, this might still be a draw anyway after d5. But looks a little bit scary. However, Richard took with a pawn, which is a good practical decision again. So he's making the right decisions, you know, and this is where the hard work is paying off. You know, he said that he's worked harder than he ever has the last year or so, because he wants to make this last push for GM title. I think it's going to be difficult. He's obviously got a great chance of getting a GM norm, but it's going to be difficult for him to get the title, because he doesn't play enough to probably gain enough points to get over 2500. So I think realistically he's not going to get to 2500 at this point in his life, but who knows? You know, you got to at least try. So I went rook e2, and Richard pushed on with d5. So this is where the Gormally weakness kicks in. You know, I'm under pressure here. He's played d5. My ego's provoked by the move d5. He's played that fairly quickly, and I felt like my ego's provoked, so I've got to make a move quickly to kind of prove that everything is okay. This is what tends to happen in my games. This is why I tend to collapse a lot, because at the critical moments I'm not calculating. So I calculate very few variations here. Chess is a very complex game. You know, you can't assume within 30 seconds of calculation that you know everything that's going on in the game, however strong you are. You often have to calculate a lot, and I didn't do that at this point, because, as I said, my ego was provoked. I was under pressure because of Richard's excellent play, and I didn't play a good move here at all. I made quite a serious mistake, followed by another serious mistake, because I'm reacting, and this has happened to me countless times over the last few years. This type of collapse is not a new development, and I think it was one of the main reasons why I've fallen all the way to 24-28. You know, I'm now listed as a weak GM, effectively on paper, and struggling to get conditions in proper tournaments. So rather than pushing on from 2573 to 2600, I've gone the other way, and yeah, I'm struggling. So anyway, it's a long-winded little explanation, but I wanted to talk about it. So obviously I did see the move queen e4. Now, why did I reject queen e4? Well, I was afraid that I didn't want to give him the option of queen takes b7. So obviously he can push. But I think that actually is okay for black because of the move rook takes a2. And when he pushes on d7, you go queen e2. And I think I saw variations like this. This is what I was trying to get in the game. So if he goes to f, so I'm effectively making attack. So he can't queen the pawn because of queen f2. Followed by a checkmate. So you probably have to go rook f1. Again, if he blocks it, you know, I've got that square covered. The d pawn is not actually that dangerous. in this position. So it goes rook f1 with threatening to win the piece, but then I can go queen d3, and this is okay for black. It's probably equal. Queen b7, for example, is possible, but I think it's probably going to like peter out to a draw. However, I think the reason I rejected queen a4 is I just didn't like the fact that he could win another pawn with queen b7. But I think the computer says that this is okay. I mean, for example, it doesn't take a lot of calculation to work out a move like queen c2 is possible. And if he goes rook f1, then you could take on a2. Yeah, okay, maybe this is still not great for black because he's still got this d pawn, but it's something you could calculate, you know, in using very little time. But I didn't do that. So obviously I was provoked. My ego was provoked off d5. I played queen a6, quite a bad move, quite quickly. And at this point in the game, I'd lost the ego battle with myself. And Richard fairly quickly went a4. And you know, like a sort of lambs to the slaughter, I now played rook b2 here because I didn't see another move. That was my intention when I went queen a6. And obviously when you look at this game in hindsight, you're like, what am I doing? You know, this is not difficult to see why rook b2 is terrible. What am I doing? You know, why am I playing rook b2? It's such a bad move. So as soon as I went rook b2, I thought, well, actually this is bad, right? Because he's got knight d4, for example. And, you know, it's looking bad because I don't really think this is actually like some kind of perpetual after this. It's not even close to being a perpetual. I mean, he's got moves like queen c3, for example. Probably other moves, queen e5 check. Looks good. Doesn't look good for black at all. However, there's something even stronger. So Richard, I think he'd already seen this earlier. He went knight e5. And as soon as he went knight e5, I realised, well, that's it, the game's up. I'd actually missed knight e5. I hadn't even seen it coming. Knight e5. Not very difficult to see. Knight e5, bishop e5, queen e5, and that's the end of the game because after queen f6 he takes and then d6 and then I can't even stop the d pawn. So I resigned at this point. Well done to Richard. So again, you know, I'm not detracting from his performance at all because I think he played a good game, you know, played a good technical game. But there were a couple of things. First, I went into a technical position quite early on. I don't think technical positions are really my cup of tea. I think I'm better in murky positions. So I think Richard is a good technical player. I'd probably be a little bit better than him in murky position, but in a technical position, he might be a little bit better than me. So, you know, I think that was something I probably should have avoided. But having got into that position, clearly my calculations breaking down because of this nerves. You know, it's not difficult to see knight e5. Michael Adams, in his book with Philip Hurtado, he talks about how to think like a super GM. You falsify variations. So you see a variation, you try to see what's wrong with it. If I'd have used that technique here, I would have quickly seen queen a6, a4, rook b2, knight e5. Not very difficult. Maybe I was a little bit rusty because I hadn't played for a week. I don't play online. It's a bad excuse to make because, yeah, Richard doesn't play at all hardly, but he does play local league matches, I think. But yeah, anyway, I lost that game. I moved on. I won the next day, you know, against a good opponent. So it's not tragic, but I just wanted to really explain why I'm losing these games. Let's have a look actually at some of the annotations. So apparently queen, if we just go back actually to that variation with bishop e5, right? What does the engine think about this? It thinks this is more or less equal. Yeah, rook fd1. What, queen d5 is worse for black, right? Yeah. Knight f3 actually is a good move. But of course you take. Actually, rook e8 is not a move I considered. With the idea just like this, yeah, actually rook e8 is a good candidate move. I should have considered that move. But if you take, yeah, there is a little bit of pressure for white. Yeah, queen b6 would be a little bit of pressure, unpleasant. You can win a pawn. But queen a5, critical. Yeah, this actually, the engine just gives zeros. right? It's just, yeah, it's close to being bad, but it's not actually bad. So rook e1 is the best move. There's weird lines like rook e1, rook a8, and then g4. Which, yeah, Leela style, right? Actually, there's only one move here, queen c5. Yeah, this would be scary to play. Queen c5 is the only move, apparently, to not be a lot worse. You could lose this. If you go g6, you could be losing like in 2 moves or something. I mean, you could play with like g6 with the idea to... What's the idea behind g6? Maybe cover the f5 square or something. h5 is also playable. Okay, h5, why is that bad? Not bad, but he can go check. Oh, he can, right, go for this position where my king is a little bit exposed, right? Yeah, yeah, awkward. I mean, practically this looks scary, right? If I go in g6 instead, I think it's probably losing by force. Yeah, lots of ways to win, like b4 wins. The king's too open. So it goes to plus 10. Queen c5 is okay though. But yeah, you have to do a bit of calculation. That's the thing. When you're lazy, you don't want to calculate these variations. You just want like an easy life, right? As soon as you see a move like knight f7, and he goes g4, I don't want to calculate this. This is too much, right? Yeah, I just want an easy life. So obviously I rejected that. So we know that, and I went for this, which is still okay. But yeah, it is a little bit of a pull for white. It's a little bit of a pull. Yeah, so I said like h5 was maybe the best, just to kind of discourage g4 forever. It's still okay. I still should hold this. Rook e4, not the most. That's kind of what I felt. I wondered about king g7, just like Karpov would have probably just gone king g7, an improving move. Maybe g4 is a little bit unpleasant, but yeah. So rook c6 looks right, felt right. In fact, yeah, I can actually just do this immediately. This was another variation which I should have seen, because it's not very difficult to calculate this, and I possibly even saw it. Actually, you know what? Why I rejected this? Because I wasn't sure about e4. You know, sometimes you reject variations because you misevaluate them, and I thought, oh, this, you know, gets his pawn to e5. It's not that clear. You know, I just want a simple life. But actually, the engine prefers black. So it's a misevaluation is why I rejected its variation. Because you can't calculate it to the end. You just go on. Sometimes you just have to go on your gut feeling. But yeah, I played king g7. Yeah, g4 was quite nice for white. I think knight d4 is quite a bad move actually, because it allows me to equalise immediately. So I could have just done this. Yeah, the engine does give a tiny edge for white after this. It's true that, yeah, this isn't completely dead. You know, you can play this, right? You would lose this if you were black against a supercomputer, I reckon. But whether I'd lose this to somebody like a human player, I'm not so sure. Maybe against Magnus I would lose this. Not many players I would lose this to, right? I'll probably lose that to Magnus, yeah. But again, you know, you've got to be confident. You've got to be confident I would draw this. Yeah, ED feels practically better. But this variation is kind of dead, right? It's not very complicated, and it's basically a draw, as I was saying. So I think rook e8 was also quite a bad error. Yeah, and then rook e4 was like an impatient move. I'm trying to force the issue. Because I don't like the tension. I don't want to go h5. Yeah, so this is where he could have gone queen b8. So queen b8 is saying the best defense is h6. If you do this, you have to find a clever move to cover the f8 square with queen b4, where you're still in the game, but it's unpleasant. ed4, rook d4 you have to find. You can't take with a bishop apparently. Well, you can, but then there's G4. Yeah. Computer just finds all these crazy moves, right? It's saying Rook D4 is the best. Wow. No, G3. The winning move. G3. I mean, some of this computer stuff. But you see how he's so happy to throw his pawns in front of the king. You know, human, we're looking at the checks here. We're looking at rook check and some kind of knight D4 move. Knight D4 loses because queen E1, bishop E5. Well, it's bad anyway. Yeah. So this is crazy stuff. So queen B8 was a serious advantage. Queen C7, not a bad practical move. Sensible move. So again, yeah, if I take here, I felt like this is a little bit unpleasant. Like rook B4. I probably should have gone for this, because I reckon in a practical game I probably would have held this. I've had a good chance of holding this position. But rook E7 was actually not bad either. So queen E6 actually was no worse than you know, the move I played was probably no worse. Yeah, rook D1 was a good move, because queen B7 we said rook E3. This variation we looked at, right? Rook C6, rook E1, yeah. Bishop E5, queen F5, and after king G2, only move, by the way, not to lose. Yeah, I was saying rook E2, which actually is not the most accurate because of queen A7. But rook D1, maybe planning queen D3 or something, I don't know. Or just rook D3 is a draw. Yeah, so how you got to be very accurate in these kind of technical positions, which I clearly wasn't in this game. So Richard went rook D1. And this is where I should have gone, yeah, I went D4, that's correct. So ED4, correct move, rook E2, yeah, all correct. D5. So queen B7, rook A2, right? It's close, it's pretty much close to being okay. It's okay. But D5, yeah, queen A6 is a howler. Queen E4, which is the most natural move on the board. Always play the most natural move unless there's something wrong with it. So queen B7, but then there's rook A2. So why am I rejecting this? This is crazy. So again, it's just nerves is kicking in. Now I'm in serious trouble. I have to grovel. It is very psychologically uncomfortable to start groveling a pawn down with rook E7, which possibly, you know, if I'd seen what was wrong with rook B2, I might have considered that, but it just feels unpleasant to do that. Just very practically unpleasant. Just to give him like an extra pawn. I think he would have converted that. So I went rook B2, which of course is a blunder, and it kind of confirms what Daniel Fernandez was saying, that in positions where I'm worse, I'm not putting up enough resistance, and that is a key thing about why my rating slipped, because knight E5 is just game over, and in order to operate at a higher level. So I've got enough ability. Sorry, it's a bit in there. I think I've got enough ability to move to a high level, but I'm letting myself down because of this weakness. So you know, I'm still getting good results occasionally, right? I'm doing well in tournaments, but I'm letting myself down because of this weakness, and because of that, I'm not showing enough consistency. So in order to have more consistency and for my rating to rise, I've got to somehow solve this weakness about moving too fast when you're under pressure. And don't get me wrong, everybody has the same issue with their chess, right? Like literally everybody has the same issue with their chess. But I think that my issue is my biggest weakness. My ego is killing my chess. You know, in situations where it gets critical, where I get less than 30 minutes or whatever, I have a tendency to collapse when I'm under pressure. When I'm not under pressure, when I'm better, I don't tend to be so nervous. I tend to be the one in control. So a lot of it is about how you can handle the situation when you're under pressure. And obviously I'm not the only one who's doing this. Other players are also collapsing under pressure. how do you solve that issue? So please leave the comments down below. What are your weaknesses? If you want to discuss it, if you want to come on this YouTube channel and discuss it, maybe we could do a video, talk about your games, about your weaknesses. I'll post my email down below if you want to drop me a line. Feel free to drop me a line and talk about what you think your weaknesses are, how you want to go about fixing them. But I do think this is a weakness that a lot of players have, this tendency to be impulsive, and I don't seem to have fixed it throughout the course of my chess career.